wobbly. Okay, Julian, I think
Okay.
I'm set.
Madam Chair, we are now live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee of the City Council. And I hereby call this meeting to order. All committee members are present today via Zoom. This is a remote or online meeting where all participants will be on a video or audio conference. We appreciate your patience as meetings are conducted in this way. Members of the public, city staff, and the media have the ability to view this meeting live through YouTube and Zoom webinar. The live stream can be accessed from most smartphones, tablets, or computers. For those watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. Written comments were received for today's meeting and were provided to members of the committee. Members of the public have the opportunity to address the committee if they signed up for live public comment per the rules published on the agenda and on our website on Friday. If you are watching the YouTube live feed for this meeting, please mute or turn it off when you are called upon to speak. We will call for the speakers when we get to the individual agenda item they signed up for. Here are the public comment ground rules. So first, I will say all members are here, present and accounted for, members of the Land Use Planning and Zoning Committee. Here are the public comment rules for this evening. Comments are to be addressed to the committee members only. Each participant has 2 minutes to present. Please keep your comments germane to the topics on the agenda, and any disruptive conduct will result in removal from the zone meeting room. There will be a 2-minute time limit when you are called upon to speak. The timer will start once you begin speaking, then the Zoom moderator, Mr. Moya, will let you know when your time is up. So first we will go to agenda item A, which is R8. Councillor Benton, would you like to introduce this legislation? Councillor Benton has disappeared from the screen. All right, I therefore, let's move on to the next agenda item. Can I do that?
If we could start with this one.
Okay, I will introduce it for Councillor Benton then at the request of staff. R8 is enabling and directing the Parks and Recreation Department to review and make recommendations for the management of the Open Space Trust Fund, review and recommend updates to sections 1 and 2 of the Rank 2 Albuquerque Major Public Open Space Facility Plan, and make recommendations for increasing equitable access to parks, open space, and to provide outdoor environmental education programs. Councillor Benton, would you like to move a do pass on this piece of legislation?
Yes, I do. Now that I caught my breath. Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll move a do pass for this legislation.
Thank you. And are there, councilors, any questions for staff or the administration?
I think we have a second from Councillor Feeblecorn,
We
Madam
do.
Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Feeblecorn. I wasn't looking at the picture. I'll get the hang again. Okay. Any questions at this point?
I do have a question as well, Madam Chair.
Okay, Councilor Feeblecorn.
So I am in full support of this. I just am looking at the new committee that will be formed, and I'm wondering what thought process was put into who, how many folks from city government versus the public were included in that committee. If somebody could walk me through that.
I can probably speak to that, Councillor.
Thank you, Councilor Benton.
Yeah, essentially, I see Ms. Young, who's a former member of the advisory board, is here to speak as well. And we have a couple of speakers identified. They're going to speak to the bill. But basically, you know, our best group of advocates, I have to say, over the years has been the advisory board. We've had a very strong advisory board over the years, and this one's no exception as it's currently made up. So this is primarily an internal group that includes the advisory board and so forth, but we a lot of the issues that have been raised here were raised in the previous bill that was vetoed and that was overridden by this council, or not overridden. The veto was upheld by this council. Excuse me. And so the issues really were extensively debated at that time. And so we've kind of gone back to the drawing board, including consultation with members of the advisory board. This bill has been crafted in cooperation with the department and the open space division. But I guess I'll probably Ms. Schultz might describe kind of how we come to the point where we are with this group and why we think it's a good process forward for the OSAB in conjunction with the department to kind of conduct these public hearings. So I consider this interim group to be relatively short-lived. But let's go ahead, if we may, Madam Chair, and go ahead and hear from Ms. Schultz to answer that question, but also to give us a briefing on just where we are with this bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Schultz?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, thanks. I'd be happy to do a little bit of an overview on this bill. R8, as Councilor Benson previously mentioned, is in response to some legislation that was adopted late last year and then vetoed. That veto message called for the city to take kind of a deeper dive into a few different things related to our major public open space program. The first thing is the funding mechanisms, how major public open space is acquired, what those pots of money are, where they come from, and how they operate. The kind of biggest one that was up for discussion last year and in the veto message was the Open Space Trust Fund. The veto message, I think, acknowledged that the Open Space Trust Fund was potentially not serving the city to the best of its ability, really should have a more thorough and comprehensive look at. And the committee that Councilor Feeblecorn is referencing is supposed to do just that, to take a look at that trust fund in addition to other funding mechanisms that exist within the city for open space acquisition. To be clear, the committee that Councilor Feeblecorn is referencing, the legislation calls for to be comprised of the CAO or their designee, 2 reps from the Parks and Recreation Department, 1 rep from the Department of Finance and Treasury, 2 reps from the Open Space Advisory Board, 1 of which who will chair the committee, and 2 reps from Council Services. Those folks are supposed to kind of put their heads together and think about all the various funding mechanisms associated with open space acquisition, and then go on to forward recommendations to the council and the mayor on any improvements that can be made to that kind of system as a whole. Councilor Feeblecorn, to answer your question more directly, it is heavily staffed by city members. You're correct. The only kind of non-city staff folks are the 2 Open Space Advisory Board members. However, I would expect that any recommendations that this subcommittee comes up with would be presented to the Open Space Advisory Board as a whole. That board conducts public meetings and takes public comments. They have quite a bit of members of the public who regularly attend their meetings and provide input on the open space program and acquisition efforts. So I do think that there is still kind of a public process baked in to the committee as a whole for when they're ready with their recommendations, that those will be presented in a way that the public will have an opportunity to participate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, are there any other questions?
Madam Chair, if I just may elaborate a little bit. So as Ms. Schultz stated, a lot of this has to do with the fiscal solvency of the trust fund and so forth. But another issue that's extremely important and that is prominent here is equitable access to open space. So parks, of course, are we try to build a park within what, we have a city policy, and Director Simon, I'm sure, is on the call and available as well, and the superintendent of open space, Ms. McRoberts. But this was one of the key issues that has been raised, and that I think the Parks Department and the Open Space Division take very seriously, and I know that we as a council do too, is the access to parks is pretty clear. We should build parks that are walkable to every neighborhood in the city. The access to open space is kind of different because it's typically, aside from the buzzgate itself, which bisects our city, the open space and the these what's called major public open space. There is a difference between that and what's, I guess, lowercase open space, which can be all sorts of things, including community gardens and any kind of neighborhood facilities and parks as well. That's all types of open space. But the major public open space system, which was created back in the 1980s, somewhere in there, that is a unique thing that tends to be on the periphery of the city. So how do we get access to that for any citizen? And I think Director Simon can probably, and Ms. McRoberts can probably speak to any questions about that. But I think that's a really important part of it as well. But the immediate task at hand is to review the existing ordinances and the existing rank 2, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Schultz, rank 2 land use plan that has to do with open space, of collectively all the open space and how we deal with that, which is a document that was created in the late 90s and has been updated. Not enough, in my opinion, over the last 22 years or so. And so it addresses that as well as how we move forward with that as well. So this is really just setting something in motion that the deadlines are over a couple of years, really, and looking at the fiscal solvency of the fund, how we can do better with that. And probably, there's a likelihood that we would need to go to the state legislature to be able to do better, to be allowed to do better with our investments in this fund and to have a sustainable source of revenue. So that's that. I know we have some folks signed up to speak. We might want to hear from them, or we might maybe if Madam Chair, if you don't mind, if we could hear from those who have signed up to speak, we could hear from them, and then perhaps hear from the administration.
Yes, sir. That's next on the agenda. Are there any other questions of Councilor Benton before we move on? In that case, do I have to move it?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor Pena.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the appropriate time or not, and I would actually like to consider a motion for no rec to full council when we do it, just because I think there's some opportunity here to, enhance this language. As I was one of the ones that voted for a variety of reasons, to utilize the money for the trust fund, just because all the money that we've acquired over the years really hasn't went to purchasing property. So we kind of have this chunk of money that's just being used and just kind of being recycled. I think that we generate, I don't remember the amount, and I don't have those notes. I was telling Councilor Fablecorn, I moved my office around, so I lost a few things, but the money that we have been able to use to secure property was actually the money that Councilor Harris had put in for that 2%, which I think that has gone a long way to make sure that we purchase property in the city of Albuquerque. And how the trust fund, as important as it is, I agree with the sentiment that we really have to make sure that it's used as it's intended, because the money right now is used for park. I think my understanding is used for mainly maintenance and not for the acquisition of property, right? It's the 2% that Councilor Harris had put in, and he had actually increased that percentage as part of his resolution. But, I really would like us to have a conversation about the definition of open space. As you all know, I had been working on some open space that wasn't, I'm of the understanding that it's defined as pristine property. And oftentimes in communities, marginalized communities, we don't necessarily find a lot of pristine property. So the example given is the Crestview Bluff, which is just a spectacular place in the city of Albuquerque. Obviously, it would need mitigation. It's not pristine, but I think it's something that really the way open space is defined, it wouldn't even allow us to be able to purchase that property. So I think we need to make those considerations as we move forward. So I would, after the discussion, after we hear public comment, I'd like to make a recommendation for no rec or to defer it to another meeting so we can kind of iron out some of those things. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Pena, are there any other points? Any more discussion from the councillors? In that case, I believe we will go on to public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're very welcome.
Our first speaker will be Tasha Young. Ms. Young, please go ahead and unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm Tasha Young. I'm a former vice chair of the Open Space Board, but I am a board member currently, and I speak only for myself today. I'm very proud to be associated with, I'm looking at lines 13 and 14 of R8, one of the nation's best city open space programs. I speak in support of this resolution. I think it creates exactly the kind of partnership between the city, the Open Space Board, and all of the members of the public who come to our meetings. It'll create a dialogue that is absolutely necessary in the best interest of this good program. So I support the resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Barbara Taylor. Barbara, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to comment on R8. My name is Barbara Taylor, and I am a former CIP official, former director of Parks and Rec, and currently a member of the Open Space Advisory Board. I'm speaking for myself today because the board has not been able to meet to develop an official position. I want to thank Councillor Benton for sponsoring this legislation and for his continuing support for the role of the Open Space Advisory Board. The board has been discussing the future of the trust fund for many months, and I certainly understand that the fund needs to improve its return on investment, or in fact, it will slowly lose its value and become useless. It is encouraging to know, however, that in the 2020 legislative session, the city, along with the Municipal League and Association of Counties, supported a bill to give local governments more latitude to invest funds on their own. Though this bill did not pass, it outlines a promising approach that could have a significant positive impact on the Open Space Trust Fund. I also want to voice wholehearted support for Section 3 of the bill regarding equitable access to parks and open space programs. I know that the superintendent of Open Space Division has made significant strides in programming opportunities for underserved communities to experience major public open space, and I look forward to more of the same. And finally, I want to express appreciation for the clear definition of major public open space available to everyone. These lands express the value that the city and county together have placed on the collective heritage of this unique place that we are privileged to live in. I know from firsthand experience how hard Parks and Rec has worked to improve, preserve, and grow this heritage. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that'll conclude public comments for this item.
Thank you, councilors. That does conclude, as said, the public comment. Councilor Benton, would you like to proceed?
Well, I would like to hear from the administration at this point, if we could, please.
Yes.
Ms. Director
Director Simon?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Councilor Benton. We support this legislation. You know, I think it's on target. It does what I think the council wants to do with respect to finances. It does what it asks for what the Open Space Advisory Board and our department wants to do with respect to looking at the management and benefits of the Open Space Trust Fund. And it gives us some very good homework assignments to prepare important information for the council for future consideration of these programs. So I think it's a good bill and we support it.
Madam Chair, I see Councilor Pena has it. I know that she has a question, but just specifically, if you could, Mr. Simon, or Director Simon, I think the question that, if this is not what the question is from Councilor Pena, is with regard to the definition of major public open space, which is sort of kind of the leading affirmation beginning in the whereases, of course, of the in the actual sections, action sections, is affirming the definition which was defined back in the 90s as to what major open space is as opposed to other open space. But without necessarily you weighing in yet, I just want to put that introductory question before Councilor Pena asks her question. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Councilor Pena?
Madam Chair, thank you for my question. Yeah, you phrased it much better than I would have, Councilor Benton. So yeah, I mean, I just really, would like to have a couple of questions answered, whether it's a move with no rec or a deferral, just to really get the position of the Open Space Board. They haven't taken a position on this bill. So I would love for us, before we proceeded to, that was kind of the criticism the last time, is that we didn't get their approval when we passed the other bill. So I think that's important. And then the other thing is that, I really would like to be able to have an opportunity to figure out what that definition is and how it applies to here at the city of Albuquerque, because it has been a challenge to, get property that's not considered pristine. And, and I think we could do a better job in terms of looking at areas that are marginalized in our community and really be able to identify, pockets within those areas for open space. And if the definition prohibits that, I know I ran into some challenges when we were working with the Crestview Bluff area, and some of the concern about that it wasn't pristine property and that it really needed a lot of remediation, but yet it's right on the arroyo, where it's at, Councilor Benton, and it's just an area that, as the report stated before, with some work and engineering from folks, we could actually bring back a lot of natural habitat and lots of, habitat from the area and the vegetation and the like. So I think, just before we proceed, we should just kind of get those questions answered. And so I would move for a deferral.
Yeah, I think as a point of order that the motion is for a due pass, but I wonder if we could hear from Director Simon as to these definition questions and sort of the distinction of, or is pristineness part of the requirement or definition, or is cultural value also important, Director Simon?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, I don't have a direct or sort of definitive position on the definition. It's the definition that's been used for years for this program. I would just say that I don't think it's so much about pristineness as just it is about the totality of the natural and cultural resources in any site that's considered for acquisition. So I think the pristineness may be a little bit of not the core issue there. But in terms of, I'll just also say that we also have set up and are excited about pursuing, new programs, new variations of our open space efforts, including our neighborhood open space program, which is specifically designed to sort of broaden the net, open the door to all kinds of projects, particularly projects that are located within our urban core. So I see, a variety of mechanisms to make good things happen for all parts of the city. And I totally share Councilor Pena's desire and goal, to have green spaces equitably distributed across our city. So however you view the definition, I think we're headed in that direction.
Yeah.
Thank you, Director Simon. And Councillor Benton, did you have a comment to that? Because you do have a motion, a do pass, and a second.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I see Superintendent McRoberts is here as well, and it would be great to hear from her as well. And I really appreciate the attitude of this administration and this particular Parks Department about these properties that are not exactly city parks, but they're not exactly major open space, and that I do support that, and I do support Councilor Pena's desire to figure out how we can create such a place on Crestview Bluffs. But I did want to hear from Ms. McRoberts, who has done such a good job as superintendent under this administration.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Ms. McRoberts.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair and Councillor Benton and the rest of the councillors. I appreciate this very thoughtful and comprehensive approach to this resolution and thinking about these issues that will have an impact in open space into the future, and bringing in the Open Space Advisory Board and staff in this conversation. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I do have our major public open space facility plan dated from 1999. We hope to update this plan in the near future. I have the definition though, and so if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to read that and then just give a couple of my thoughts. The definition is very encompassing. It's not really restrictive. It says that the comprehensive plan defines major public open space as an integrated system of lands and waters that have been designated as such in the comprehensive plan. These lands and waters or interests therein have been and shall be acquired, developed, used, and maintained to retain their natural character to benefit people throughout the metropolitan area by conserving resources related to the natural environment, providing opportunities for outdoor education and recreation, or defining the boundaries of the urban environment. And then there's a number of bullets that kind of identify open space and its purpose, the conservation of natural resources and environmental features, provision of opportunities for outdoor education and recreation, shaping of the urban form, conservation of archaeological resources, provision of trail corridors, and protection of the public from natural hazards like arroyos. And so, I do think that that's a definition that we can continue to build on and work from personally, but obviously this committee, I think, can delve into that a lot more as stated in this resolution. The other thing I'd like to mention that the Open Space Advisory Board had worked on is a matrix for identifying acquisitions of open space. This matrix is, I think includes a lot of detail about what we should look at, including equitable access. That's something that was integrated into this matrix last year. And we also identified this concept of neighborhood open space and developed a matrix for that as well. So we can share that with the counselors, and I think that can also be used as this committee convenes and really gets into the details of this a lot more. But just to say that this has been identified, we have been thinking about these things for a while, and I think, we have a good starting place for sure.
Thank you. Councillor Benton, you have a motion on the floor for a do pass.
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me, Councillor Pena has her hand up again. Councillor Pena.
Yeah, well, let's hear from her.
So thank you. I appreciate that. That was one of my two-pronged questions, is that, it sounds as though I would I would still like to have the time to kind of really make sure that that's in there, because I know that, and I don't have the report in front of me when we did the Crestview Bluff, but I know that that was a challenge that we had to overcome. So there's something within kind of the defining factors somewhere along the line. If we could just get clarity, because I just do want to make sure that, you know, communities like that, that are marginalized really do have an opportunity to have their voice at the table and have an opportunity to create open space. So I kind of still stick to that, just so that as long as I get comfort in terms of, for sure. And then my other question would be is that the deferral, I would still stand by the deferral, because we were criticized last time because we did it without the approval. They said open space board actually said that they were not able to meet to make a decision on whether they supported the resolution or not. And I think that you know we have to, if that's what our argument was last time, I think we need to make sure that we do it this time, and make sure that they're able to convene and make a decision whether they support the resolution or not. Obviously, it seems as though it's a no-brainer for them, but just because of what the criticism was last time. And then I just wonder where the administration stands on all of this. I don't know if if somebody from the administration is here. I don't know if they would support a deferral or not support a deferral.
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, you know, we are happy to support the wishes of the committee with respect to that motion. We're agnostic on that issue, but the bill is, I think the bill is drafted sensitively with the thoughts of the Open Space Board clearly at the forefront, but we're happy to defer to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Simon. Councilor Pena? Are you- Okay, Councilor Benton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I think Ms. Schultz wanted to clarify. I think Ms. McRoberts was reading directly out of the 1999 document, but there is a definition of open space within the comprehensive plan, the city-county comprehensive plan. So you might want to read, and then, you know, that is the defining document ultimately. But and then my understanding from the two members of the OSEB is that they do intend to hear it. We were not going to move this for immediate action or anything like that. I don't mind leaving it in committee, but I would like to get this process moving, because there's a lot of work to be done over the next couple of years. But let's hear from Ms. Schultz.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Ms. Schultz?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, thank you. I just wanted to offer a point of clarification. Ms. McRoberts did read the definition that is located in the rank 2 facility plan, which does reference the comprehensive plan. However, that comprehensive plan that rank 2 plan references is no longer in place. The city has since updated their comprehensive plan, and therefore the definition for major public open space has also been updated. So I'll just quickly read what that definition is. It's in the resolution itself on page 2, line 20. It says the definition of major public open space as derived in the Albuquerque/Bernalillo County Comprehensive Plan shall be an integrated network of land and water that has been or shall be acquired, developed, used, and maintained to retain their natural character to benefit people throughout the metropolitan area by conserving resources related to the natural environment, providing opportunities for outdoor education and passive recreation, or defining the boundaries of the urban environment. I think it's very similar to the definition that Ms. McRoberts read. It's been it's a little more concise than the definition from the old comprehensive plan. I just wanted to be clear that this resolution establishes that as the definition as it exists in the comprehensive plan that's on the books today.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. And could I ask about the schedule of the Open Space Advisory Board? I believe they would meet prior to the council hearing this bill. And so we would have them weighing in along with this committee before the full council. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, looking at my calendar, it looks like the next Open Space Advisory Board meeting is scheduled for March 22nd. Yep, I see Ms. McRoberts nodding her head at me. So if this moves out of committee tonight, it would be reported out at the city council meeting on March 21st, and then the Open Space Advisory Board would meet the next day and may be able to put this item on their agenda for review before it would be up for final consideration by the council on April 4th.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilors, are there any other questions? Councilor Benton, we have a do pass with a second on the table.
I urge your support, councilors.
Thank you. Would you call the roll, please?
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Council Vibocorn,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez,
Yes.
Counselor Jones.
Yes.
That passes on a 5-0 vote.
Thank you, councilors, and thank you, Councilor Benton. This could be a game changer. Councilor Benton, if you don't mind, please, I would like for you to move the next item on the agenda, which we are co-sponsoring.
And I need to get to my script here. Okay, the next item is O2210. This is adopting citywide text amendments to the Integrated Development Ordinance 14-16 for the 2021 IDO annual update. I think that's supposed to say 2022. And adopting text amendments for a small mapped area, the Old Town Historic Protection Overlay Zone HPO 5. And I'll move a recommendation to pass.
And I'll second that.
And councilors, I'll leave that. I guess the rest of this, you have your script there, unlike
Yes.
me, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. See, we're confused tonight. Thank you, Councilor Benton. To those, we do have a motion do pass in a second. So to those watching, please be aware that today's meeting will only consist of public comment and a staff presentation. The committee is not expected to vote on any proposed amendments tonight, with the intention to defer this item to March 30th. Councilors will begin with public comment. We will hear first from those who signed up to speak regarding cannabis prohibitions in Old Town. This item is quasi-judicial and requires that members of the public be sworn in. If you will be speaking to this, please raise your right hand. And do you affirm under penalty of perjury that your testimony today will be true? Thank you.
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Moyer, would you please begin calling the speakers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first speaker is Michael Buck. Michael, if you're there, please go ahead and unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking. Madam Chair, looks like he may not be there. I'll move on to the next speaker, which is Jesse Ehrenberg. Jesse, please feel free.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
All
your
right.
time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you. Chairwoman Jones and members of the committee. My name is Jesse Ehrenberg. I live in Old Town. My take on this issue is one of marketing. Old Town is has a special position in Albuquerque and needs to be marketed as such. To compete as just another center for food, alcohol, and marijuana is never going to be a successful strategy. There's already endless places to go for that. Nob Hill, Central, and hundreds of neighborhood bars and restaurants. And right around the corner from Old Town, there's the Sawmill. What Old Town has that these places don't is history. People don't come here from around the world to New Mexico to just eat and drink. They come to see the pueblos and towns like Madrid, Silver City, and Mountain Air. They come to Old Town for the same reason. Old Town should be what people used to call family friendly. If people specifically want to get high from cannabis, there will be plenty of places they can go in the surrounding area. There will even be one opening right across the street on Mountain Road. So let's play to our strengths. And for that reason, I support Bill R-21-165, prohibiting permissive and conditional uses for cannabis and cannabis products outlined in the IDO in the Old Town HPO 5 zone. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Sylvia Ramos Cruz. Sylvia, please go ahead and unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening. I live in Old Town and have been here since 1999. I am a member of the Historic Old Town Property Owners Association and the Old Town Portal Market Advisory Board. I enjoy living in Old Town because it's a place that has deep roots, a tiny town built in 1706 that still has the look and feel of a Spanish town with adobe buildings, residences and businesses clustered together, arranged around the plaza, anchored by the church. We link the city's past to its up-and-coming present and its vibrant future. Therefore, preserving this historic heart is essential to Albuquerque's well-being, identity, and character. But we also want to preserve its business heart as a place where people from all over New Mexico, the United States, and the world come to learn about and experience New Mexico history, enjoy a nice meal, shop for authentic arts and crafts, and do business in a safe, welcoming, family-friendly, and pleasant atmosphere. I believe that allowing cannabis businesses to locate in Old Town is not conducive to preserving its character as a heritage place. Such businesses will add nothing to the life of the people who live, do business, and work here, or to the experience of local family and tourists who come here. I believe the presence of cannabis businesses in Old Town will degrade its image, as well as the quality of life for those of us who live and work here. And it will adversely affect Old Town's economic potential as an Albuquerque and New Mexico unique and distinctive historical attraction. That is why I support amendments to the IDO to prohibit cannabis business uses within the historic Old Town zone. I respectfully ask you to support and help enact those amendments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael Buck, are you there and connected now?
Hello. Oh, yes, sir. My apologies. I meant to speak on the car wash issue, not the cannabis issue.
Okay, I have you listed for that item as well, so I'll call your name when that item comes up.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Madam Chair, that does conclude public comment for the cannabis, related to the cannabis retail in Old Town. If you would like, I can proceed to the public comment for the general citywide changes.
Would you please, Mr. Morel?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our first speaker will be Jane Beckel. Jane, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, Madam Chair and councilors. I'm speaking this evening as an individual, but I do want to amplify some points that I made earlier today in written comments submitted on behalf of the Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association. Providing safe and acceptable shelter for those experiencing homelessness is an ethical and moral imperative for the city of Albuquerque. It requires a whole of city response, with every section of the city providing shelter resources. The equitable answer cannot be to assume that this imperative applies only to a portion of neighborhoods or certain city areas. The IDO amendments, particularly those submitted last week, don't provide much detail about how the zoning changes proposed will actually result in the provision of shelter resources. They also do not provide evidence that these amendments will have equitable impact across all parts of the city, and don't actually change my concern that that will not be the case. I would ask the council, the committee, to defeat amendments A12 and A13 and remove language in the IDO red line draft that limits public input. If the council is committed to equity and public engagement, each councillor could explicitly affirm support for the creation of shelter resources within their district and use public meetings to ensure inclusive decision-making before changing zoning laws. A process like that would represent a genuine commitment to equity. I noticed that the Hope City website documents their quote, strong backing of the community. They don't say how they achieved that, but I believe it was probably with considerable efforts at public engagement. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Martin Baca. Martin, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening, Madam Chair and City Councilors. I'm here to speak on the car wash operating hours. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
My name is Martin Baca. I was born here in Albuquerque, and I have lived here my entire life, except for the time when I did serve in the United States Navy. I've been a manager in the self-serve car wash industry for over 22 years, and I feel this amendment unfairly attacks self-serve car washes. Although there is a large customer base for self-serve car washes, and our customers enjoy the option of the 24-hour convenience. I think that loitering in the city is not due to our business being open. Loitering is not limited to self-serve car washes. Loitering occurs at all locations throughout the city, especially at grocery and department store parking lots. We do post no trespassing signs on our property that police officers can use in cases of loitering. Our equipment is not designed to be turned on and off every night and every morning. How do we keep people from using the equipment? I don't know actually of any other city that closes their self-serve car washes at night. How would we even keep people off of our lot even if the equipment is turned off? I support law enforcement, and I regularly offer police officers a free wash and encourage them to park on our lot day and night so that they can do their paperwork in their vehicles. I feel this amendment will create more problems for the police force, business owners, and for the public than what it will solve. I feel this should be a choice for the citizens of Albuquerque and for the business owners. In closing, this amendment is unfair because it targets the entire car wash self-serve industry. If there are nuisance locations, the city should handle them individually, not punish the entire self-serve car wash industry as they do other businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Michael Buck. So please mute yourself and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you for the chance to speak. My name is Michael Buck. I'm the state supervisor with DECRA North America, and I'm over two of the self-serve car washes here in Albuquerque. I know the amendment says about loitering, but we don't have a loitering problem at any of our locations. And if we did, we would combat and address that any way that we could. I don't think it's fair to single out car washes versus other businesses. Every business does have loitering problems. And as far as I said before, we don't have loitering problems at our business. We will also lose a significant amount of revenue if you guys were to limit our hours. I pretty much don't have anything else to say on the matter. I just think it's arbitrary that it doesn't make any sense to shut our business down because of people loitering. And if it is happening at certain car washes, then I would ask that you guys address those car washes and not make it a blanket for every single business. Thank you for the time to speak. Have a good night.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Josh Rogers. Josh, please feel free to turn your video on. Your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you. Good evening, councilors. Josh Rogers with Titan Development. I have four of the amendments I'd like to speak about. The first one is Amendment A2 on the hotel conversions to multifamily. These conversions are starting to happen all over the city, and they've proven to be a very attractive multifamily housing type for low-income renters. These conversions have taken dilapidated hotels that have been run down over the past 50 years and converted them to very useful multifamily housing at a very inexpensive rental price. Amendment A2 is great, but it's worded so that it only applies if funding is provided through the city's Family and Community Services Department. I think it'd be great for the council to expand A2 to include any hotel conversion, regardless of where the funding is coming from, to provide more low-income housing opportunities. It's really the only way that developers can provide low-income housing without having to go through government tax credits. Next, I'd like to discuss Amendment A9. While this is well intended to increase density along major transit corridors, which I applaud, I don't think the city really needs to go this far. Townhomes are a great product for urban corridors, and when done right, can achieve moderate densities over 10 units an acre. This housing type is used in many great cities, which have far greater densities than Albuquerque. Brownstones and row houses are all found in great abundance in cities like Boston and New York, along major transit routes. This amendment seems unnecessary. Let's just let the market decide what's needed. Next is Amendment 810. I support the repeal of last year's amendment. After living through this on 2 projects, it added between $4,000 and $12,000 worth of costs, and it provided nothing of value. These studies are not yielding anything useful, and the projects are being designed through zoning, market forces, neighborhood edges, and other design-related issues. And this just seems like a costly effort. It's adding time, energy, and a lot of useless aspects to our DRB submittals. Lastly, I fully support Amendment A11. We have researched our parking ratios extensively at our multifamily projects and have found conclusive evidence that shows we are building way too much parking in our projects. That's adding to climate change, heat island effects, and lowering the density of our projects. Thank you to all the staff and counselors for your time.
Thank you, Josh. Your time is up. Thank you. Next speaker is Debbie O'Malley. Commissioner, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am. Please proceed.
Okay, no, turn it off, please. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I did want to speak to a few of the amendments. The first one was A2, which is the hotel conversions to residential uses for affordable housing. I strongly support that. We essentially, and I'm going to support the other amendments associated with providing safe outdoor spaces and temporary campgrounds as well. Those are A12, A13. I don't think we need to, I think we all agree that we have a crisis around homelessness, have for some time. It's really become a public health crisis. And I think anything we can do to provide housing as soon as possible. Most of this would be transitional housing, but at this point, we really don't have any other options for folks who are experiencing homelessness and who are on the streets. So I think the more options we could provide, especially immediately around the safe outdoor spaces, provide that. Temporary campgrounds could provide that as well. I haven't really looked at the details of the safe outdoor spaces and temporary campgrounds, but I know I do have an opportunity to really delve deeply into that. The county is hoping to put a project together soon using that particular amendment. The other one is A3 and A4. I'm going to put on another hat, not my elected official hat, but my developer hat. I'm the first one to use the cottage development zone. It doesn't work very well. And I'm sure that you can see the document that says that. We really need to make it work. And as I've started processing, putting the plan together, I could see that it didn't allow, for example, the other lot. For example, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you can't calculate the rest of a lot. Like if you have 17,000 square feet, for example, this allows that to happen percentage-wise, a percentage of the square footage. And then the square footage itself for the largest lot is too small, too little of a square footage. It's 2,000 square feet for a 10,000 square foot lot. You wouldn't put cottage development on there if you're limited to 2,000 square feet. I mean, it's just not going to work. It doesn't work financially. It doesn't work economically. So I appreciate the support for that. And then I don't know how much more time I have. I think that was largely it.
I think you're out of time. I think you're out of time.
Okay, thank you very much.
But just a second, Councilor Benton, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question for Commissioner O'Malley. Mr. Rogers of Tight Development spoke about the motel conversion. What you're thinking about that, the way it's written right now, it's really only for projects that are developed by the city or with city support. He was arguing that this should be something that we might want to do citywide. What are your thoughts on that, Commissioner?
Okay, that's an interesting idea, and I think that's something worth considering. I mean, obviously, we're going to be thinking about this now, right? My understanding is this conversion allows for not having to have a full stove, for example, but could have, because, we're talking about small units already. It's interesting that, if you get an Airbnb or some of these smaller casitas, that's exactly what they do have for you to use, right? This idea is not to have, ideally, when you're talking about this sort of housing, you hope that it doesn't, become years and years, that this is the final place for people to live. I mean, we want to be able to create some other options, but it's one of the more efficient ways to address homelessness and get families in safe, secure housing. So I think that this is, that's a good question, Counselor. I think it's something that the committee should consider. I don't know at this point. I just thought, quite frankly. Okay, thank you.
I know you're an advocate for anything and everything that can increase the stock of affordable housing. So I thought it was an interesting point that he was making, and maybe this is something, all of these amendments, of course, we can continue to craft as we go forward.
No, Counselor, and if I may add to that, it was interesting. I actually was walking by Java Joe's, and of course, right next to it is it the Silver Moon, or was these apartments, which are I think 60% are below the median income. I think the entire project is like that. But as I was walking past, I just mentioned to my nephew, and I said, I wonder what the rent is over there. And this young man just said, it's too high, he said. And he just went on to talk about how difficult it is for young people to live in town, that they're basically being pushed out of downtown because of the rent hikes. And, and this is a real problem. I mean, it really came home again as to the issue that how people are struggling to be able to pay rent. Young people, single people, families, it's just a big, big struggle. So I yes, whatever we can do to help people, be in safe housing, I think that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. O'Malley, and thank you, Councillor Benton. Mr. Moya.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our next speaker is Dan Regan. Dan, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when we start speaking.
All right, had a little trouble getting the unmute off. I'm going to talk to A10. On a general principle, I am against swinging the pendulum on any type of amendment in 1 year. If you swing it from one apex to the other, you give people lots of headaches. So it went in last year. To take it out this year on general principle, I think is not very smart. In particular, I will speak to the explanation that's in the amendment. It says that it has no teeth. Well, I think it's wonderful that it got into the people's radar that Albuquerque has expectations, that we ask that you take our environment into account if you're going to build something that will last. I think that's important. The 2018 IECC is mentioned. That document is based on stuff not any more recent than 2016. We're in 2022. There's been a new report put out by the UN on international level, like the IECC is, that says warming is happening faster and with greater intensity than we ever expected before. That ICC is international level. It's out of touch with high desert New Mexico. Our situation is we keep adding heat. Josh mentioned the heat sinks of asphalt, and the heat dries out everything. I don't know how many of the councilors are aware that the oxbow right now is starting to dry up. Beavers are a little bit responsible for that, but the increased heat is also in play. You've seen articles from P&M and other people about electrical brownouts over the next several summers. If we don't start cutting down on the need for cooling and heating, where are we going to be?
Thank you, Dan. Your time is up. Thank you. Our next speaker is Jonathan Siegel. Jonathan, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening, Madam Chair and councilors. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, please proceed.
I'm speaking tonight to two related amendments to the IDO having to do with cottage developments in the R1 district. Commissioner O'Malley spoke about the same matter. We were retained to study a lot of about 1/3 of an acre zoned R1D with a small existing house. I'm an architect here in town and former member of the Planning Commission, incidentally. Cottage development is mapped as available for the parcel in question. And under the IDO as written, the lot could support a house and one cottage, which is hardly a cottage development. This seems not to be the purpose of having cottage development in the IDO. Expanding allowable area to a percentage basis is an enormous help, and the recommendation to increase the area basis to 2,600 feet or thereabouts is also a very big help. And in the subject case that I was looking at, would make a feasible project and a lovely project, really, of 1/3 of an acre that would be able to, in our studies, finally include 4 cottages and the existing house, and still easily meet the required open space necessities as spelled out in the IDO, no complaints there, the parking and so forth. So I think it was just a case of not really vetting it as it might have been. I can show an example site plan if it would interest the councilors, or otherwise I'm done.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'd like to see the site plan if we can, if that's doable.
Thanks, Councilor Benton. Yeah, Mr. Siegel, do you have a site plan that you can show us, or do we have to do it up? There it is.
Let me try and get it on my camera.
Excuse me, gentlemen, I think we're being told that we shouldn't do this.
I would encourage the councilors to not review this site plan if this is a potential application that might come before the city. In the case of an appeal, I think you all know that you sit as jurors in those instances, and we wouldn't want.
All right. Anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel. We're trying to be nice about this, but the good news is Councilor Benton had the same answer I did. So thank you, Mr. Siegel, for trying to help.
Apologize for the indiscretion. I hadn't thought about appeals and all the rest. What I want to say is that it's very nice to be able to make increased density around a courtyard and around a lovely setting. And it can be done if you'll pass, I believe it's A3 and A4. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Renee Horvath. Renee, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Hello. My name is Renee Horvath, and I am with the West Side Coalition and Taylor Ranch, but we just got these amendments. I just saw them for the first time last Thursday. And so we're still trying to figure out what they all, a little more explanation, because we went through the citywide amendments last fall, and we spent a month having several meetings with Michaela explaining all the 60-something amendments last fall, and we were better prepared for the EPC. So my question is, are these amendments going to the EPC or just City Council? And what is the process? The next hearing is date for Lutz is the 30th. Are you going to take a final vote on this? Because there's a lot of people asking questions about some of these amendments so that we understand exactly what they're proposing, because we can kind of see some of the good and some of the bad, and we want to make sure they're thoroughly vetted so we get a very good product out of these amendments. So some of the things that really caught my attention, we spent a lot of time talking about the overnight shelters last fall, and including the campgrounds. And so we do have some questions about what is the vision for the campgrounds? We'd like a little more explanation. Reduction in parking, A11 for multifamily and retail. We will have a lot of problems with that. That will be really bad for the people that use these apartments. I don't think there's enough parking for them now. And as somebody mentioned, the rents are going up. So if you have a 3-bedroom apartment, you may have 3 different people with 3 different cars that need spaces for 3 different cars. But I think we've reducing it to 2 cars or 1 car. The other one,
Thank you,
removing.
Renee. Your time is up.
Ms. Horvath, just
You're muted, Council.
Ms. Horvath, as a reminder, this is not being heard tonight. These amendments will go before the LUPS committee on the 30th.
Okay, so can we have someone explain some of these amendments?
Ms. Horvath, you have the right to contact any of our city staff whenever you would like.
And have a meeting, a Zoom meeting.
Ms.
to
Horvath, you
explain.
will have to call the city staff and set up an appointment. I can't do that for you right now. I can't answer that question specifically, but the city staff will help you understand these and answer any questions for you. And again, these will not be heard until the 30th.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Avery Volkman. Avery, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Good evening, everyone. Madam Chair and members of the council, I appreciate your time this evening. My name is Avery Volkman, and I have come to speak out briefly against Amendment A1 about the car wash operating hours. Currently, I own and operate 5 self-serve car washes in the Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, and Bernalillo areas, and have done so for the almost 20 years. This new proposal is very concerning because it would force new hours of operation upon our businesses, and in doing so would cause not only undue hardship upon our business, but would be hard to enforce and would potentially set up that all businesses, parking lots, and that any place that people gather would come under this new curfew. We must ask ourselves, what is the core problem, and would forcing hours of operation upon a single type of business really solve this problem? And why are car washes being singled out? I know previous gentlemen have spoken. We don't necessarily have any loitering issues at our car wash that go on from a long period of time. After all, I suspect that there are many businesses throughout Albuquerque that have empty parking lots and that are unattended where people gather during the night. And I sent in a list of explanations about why this would be hard for us as a car wash owner and a business owner. We are a family business and have been doing this, like I said, for 20 years. One of the reasons of we'd have loss of revenue, significant. Loss of service would be provided to our customers. There are significant hurdles to overcome. There are hardware and software issues which prevent us actually from closing down our washes. The software and hardware are not necessarily designed to be shut down on and off all the time. This new proposed hour sign would be just another sign that we already have listed on our sites. We have a no loitering sign, no trespassing sign, no panhandling sign that we were told to put up by the APD and police officer or members of the city.
Thank you, Avery. Your time is up.
Oh, okay.
Madam Chair, if I may follow through with Mr. Volkman.
Yes, of course, Councilor Benton.
I share some of these concerns that we're singling out a specific type of business. And you know, I think some of the anecdotal discussion had to do with APD officers telling neighbors and such that they can't do anything about people loitering on a business where they're not welcome. And I think before we actually start voting on these amendments at the next meeting, we ought to hear from police department as to what they can and cannot do. If a business owner such as Mr. Volkman is posting no trespassing and people are just hanging out, not doing anything with their cars, but rather just fooling around in somebody's private property, then I would hope that that kind of anecdote does not indicate a general policy of the Albuquerque Police Department. And so, this may or may not be something that can be solved by zoning, and rather needs to be solved by public safety personnel and what their policies are for removing unwanted people from private property. But it looks like Ms. Shanna may have some elaboration on that as well.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, I think I heard a pretty direct request from you that we seek some additional information from APD prior to when a vote may be taken on these amendments at the March 30th LEPS hearing. I've made a note of that. I don't believe we have anyone from APD on the committee hearing tonight, but I will get some information for you prior to that next hearing.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Schultz. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next speaker is Bradley Day. Bradley, please feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Am I on?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Can you see me?
I cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Well, that's okay. I didn't dress up for this thing anyway. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to speak on the safe outdoor spaces. The reason for that is I've spent the last 2 years taking a look at how to deal with the trespassing and the trash and the needles that commercial property owners like myself have to deal with. And like with any other business problem, many times you can find a really cost-effective solution by taking a look at a franchise that deals with that type of problem or that type of product. And the franchise, in this case, the McDonald's of homeless shelters, is Camp Hope down in Las Cruces. I've spent a lot of time talking to their people, going down there. I've gotten all their protocols. Their track record is absolutely fantastic. They've been in operation for 11 years. They serve about 200 people a year, and it is extremely cost effective. And basically the idea is to give these people a base to work from, where they have showers, bathrooms, a mailing address, a place to store their belongings or their shopping carts, and get them from living in a tent, which is what they would have with a safe outdoor space, and get them into permanent housing. That's the objective. And they have been very effective at it. And the amount of expense that's involved is so much better than anything else we're doing. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you. So
your time is up. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jim Price. Jim, please feel free to turn your video back on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Hi, my name is Jim Price. Thank you, councilors, for allowing me to speak. I wanted to speak again in opposition to the proposed changes to the outdoor and site lighting section. The idea of removing the shielding from all light sources, it would be detrimental to the night sky. It would defeat the stated purpose of that section, which is to prevent light pollution between properties. Striking, all outdoor lighting with fixtures allowing light sources to be seen on adjacent properties. It would nullify most of the whole IDO. LED lighting has replaced all other forms of lighting: incandescent, metal halides, high pressure sodium, compact fluorescent, whatever. and LED lighting is very new. It is extremely intense lumen output for just a single LED, which can cause blinding, glare, just make things unlivable and unsafe. So I did write a letter to the council. I hope would be read upon that. I don't know why this is being introduced. The only thing I could see is that somebody felt street lights and street lamps should be unshielded. You know, we went to the dark skies, and the whole PNM and everybody's had to do lighting that only shines down, that doesn't shine to the side. If you remove shielding, you have lighting go to the side and go up, and then once again reduce. It would be detrimental to the night sky. That language here is also contradictory to the idea of regulating the internally lit signs, because one of the reasons to regulate the internally lit signs was so it wouldn't be detrimental to the dark skies. My wife and I built a property on the west side 6 years ago.
Jim. Your time is up.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Reverend Bob LaValle. Reverend, please feel free to turn your video on, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Hey, y'all. Good to see you. I'm Reverend Bob LaValle. I serve First Unitarian Church as the Associate Minister. We're thinking about hosting a safe parking program. So we're watching this amendment with interest. A12 I'm talking about. I have a couple quick comments about how this amendment helps or hinders us in our efforts. First, I want to say thanks for removing the overnight supervision requirement. Back in January, I visited a safe parking program hosted by Jewish Family Services in San Diego. It's a great program, very mature. They don't do overnight supervision. Folks supervise themselves, and it's very effective. However, so thanks for that part, but the 6-foot opaque fence mandate might make it impossible for us to do this. So I'd like to understand better the reasoning behind it, and better yet, ask that you take it out. And just out of curiosity, I'm wondering where the ratio of porta johnies of 8 to 1, 8 spots for one porta johny came from. So that's my comments.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
If I may, I think, Ms. Schultz is prepared to go through the amendments, and we can hopefully answer that question, unless you'd prefer to just answer it right now.
I think Councillor Benton we're almost ready to go through that presentation. If the people on screen would just watch a little longer, I think you'll see some answers to your questions. Thank you, Councillor Benton, for mentioning that.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Peggy Neff. Peggy, please unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
I leave my video dark so that I can represent others who cannot attend. It's a shame that we can't have voices from all sectors of the community. I have asked many times for Councilwoman Jones and for Councilman Benton to recuse themselves from votes on all things IDO. I will ask that again. I personally believe that while you have good intentions, you have seriously compromised situations, and your vote is not without compromise. Anyway, I have asked that the amendment process be looked at, and I think that a few things are really important for all amendments in front of the city to have. They need to have a summary statement describing the origins and the motivations behind the amendment. They need a justification. They need examples that show both the current issue and the proposed changes. They need summaries of expected impact with estimated number of residents that will be affected. They need possible unintended consequences to be summarized. That would have helped with the cottage development problem, it would help with a lot of things that are right now currently influencing the blighting of mobile home people. People who live in mobile homes are now going to be challenged with putting a plaque on their homes or facing a higher degree of violations of ordinances. I think that the public comments that should go forward are things that approach common consent. I don't believe that you should go forward with this process of 100 amendments every year. It's exhaustive. You have no oversight in place for it. You cannot continue to do this without putting the city at great risk of lawsuits. There are
Thank you,
several
Peggy. Your time
lawsuits
is
right
up.
now in front of you. I just have one more comment to make about due process. Due process requires an independent body to oversee and to be impartial in decision makings. You can't both write your laws and make
Thank you.
judgments on them.
Thank you, Peggy. Our next speaker is Frank Comfort. Frank, feel free to turn your video on, unmute yourself, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Yeah, Madam Chair, councilors, thank you. We have the same concerns as Wisconsin from Renee from Wisconsin. We didn't receive also the information, the amendments, the 16 amendments until very late. We haven't had the proper ability to review them thoroughly. So we don't, at this time, we don't even know what they're really going to, the impact is. We can't tell, like from A3 to A11 and so forth, that when you take space away, it's going to, the intent, when you take parking spaces away, it seems like it's going to increase high density, but we don't know that for sure. We don't know for sure by changing the parking for the multifamilies and cutting those back, if it's going to create any issues with our families and trying to make them use bus services more, which limits their accessibility to other services, whether it's schools or medical appointments or anything like that. We don't know. We don't know if that's true or not, since we haven't had time to really vet some of these and work with the city to find out what's the intent, how's it going to work. We would still appreciate a meeting, and I remember what you said with Wisconsin. So we look forward to those meetings to try to figure out how it's actually going to affect our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comfort. And just a reminder that the amendments will not be heard until March 30th, at which point they will be heard and maybe amended and maybe go on to council or maybe not be amended. So I think you have quite a lot of time yet to look at these and try to understand them and ask questions, but I appreciate your concern, sir. Thank you for being here this evening.
Our next speaker is Gillum Curley. Gillum, please feel free to turn your video on, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, council members. I am a member of the group of citizens, ad hoc group of citizens who requested the Safe Outdoor Spaces Amendment number 812, but I'm speaking solely for myself. One of the problems with Albuquerque's approach to the homelessness crisis has been to assume that the homeless, or treat the homeless as a monolith, subject to a one-size-fits-all solution. And they aren't. There are many homeless people who simply do not fit in shelters. And they end up being the ones who camp in ad hoc, unofficial, and often unwanted land uses on sidewalks, parks, private property where they're not welcome, etc. So this is a proposal to bring them into areas where they are welcome to camp and to give them some stability while relieving our city of the burden of clearing encampments, relieving our neighborhoods, businesses of having to confront people camping on their doorsteps. What we have done is to construct a proposal that also does not fall into this trap of one size fits all. To have a lot of flexibility between, say, a church that wants to have 2 families and a 40-person, perhaps professionally managed space which needs professional social workers more than it needs security. So that's what we tried to do, is to be as flexible as possible. I don't object to A13, the temporary campgrounds proposal, but it should not be adopted instead of the safe outdoor spaces. I mean, it's fine to adopt it in addition, but I think it does have some what may be poison pill requirements that make it too expensive to provide this service. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jim Strozer. Jim, your time will begin when you start speaking.
All right. Thank you, Councilors. Jim Strozer with Consensus Planning. I'll be brief. I really appreciate you providing the opportunity to speak to these amendments, and I appreciate all the work that staff has done. I'm going to talk first about the hotel conversion, A2. I'm very much in support of that, and I would echo the comments from Josh Rogers earlier that I think it should be open to all hotel conversions, not just those that receive city funding for those projects. I think it's a great way to get additional affordable housing into the market in a way that's going to be very effective. And so I definitely support that. I also want to echo Commissioner O'Malley, Brad Day, and Gillum that you just heard from. I've worked with them on this idea of the safe outdoor spaces. I think we've got to figure out a different way to address this problem. And people always say, well, this solution is the only one. I don't buy that. We've got to look at a multitude of ways to address this problem and help the community, those most needy in our community. And I think this is a way to do that and add another tool to our toolbox. And I'm very much in support of that. And I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. A10, repeal of the climatic. I've worked on several projects where we've done it. I haven't seen any value added to the project. I think there's an assumption that we're not taking those things into consideration in the design. And of course, we work with architects and engineers and developers all the time, and we definitely take those things into account upfront as part of the design of any project. And then A11, we just have too many parking spaces. I think we need to look at that and reduce the number of parking. So with that, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all the hard work you all have put into this, as well as the staff, Shanna, and everyone, Petra, the whole shooting match. A lot of hard work's gone into this, and I really appreciate everybody's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Rhiannon Samuel. Rhiannon, please feel free to turn your video on, and your time will begin when you start speaking.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Rhiannon Samuel. I am the Executive Director for NEOP New Mexico. We're the Commercial Real Estate Development Association. I'm here to speak in favor of 4 different amendments that are before you. First one is A2. Like Jim Strozer and Josh Rogers, we'd like to see that expanded, so it's not just limited to the Family and Community Services funding or funding coming from the city, as our folks are looking to be more responsive to the drastic housing shortage that we have for folks. The next one is A10 with a climatic and geographic responsiveness. If you read the language that was put into place, it takes into account things like views of the Sandia Mountains, the Bosque, the Rio Grande. As Jim has already mentioned, those are things that our folks look at while they're designing things, because it makes it more desirable for the tenants to go in there. And so it just was overly burdensome and not cost effective. Although this analysis shows that it was $5,000 that they would have to spend, we have, I have accounts from my folks that it's going to be more like $12,000, furthering the disruptions to growing our economy and the development process. The final 2 I want to speak to are A11. I won't belabor that point, but we do have too many parking spaces, and we need to make sure that we have more density throughout our city to respond to the housing shortage yet again. And then finally, A14, the utility easements related to vacations of right-of-way. So thank you so much for your time, your commitment to the city and looking through the IDO each year. We believe that if you pass these things, hopefully with those little amendments, they will be positive steps towards easing the development process. Thank you.
Thank you. And councilors, that is our last speaker for this evening. But we do have a presentation from the city staff. City staff who may speak to this agenda item must be sworn in. So would you please raise your right hand, or hands as it were? Do you affirm under penalty of perjury that your testimony today will be true?
I do.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz and Ms. Morris. Therefore, please proceed with the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I am pleased to give you this presentation tonight that will give you an overview of the 2021 IDO annual update process. Councilor Benton, you had noted in the beginning that maybe you thought this was supposed to be 2022, but this is the 2021 update, even though we are in 2022. This one was initiated in the year 2021. We'll be embarking on the 2022 update later this fall. With that, I will go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to do a general overview of the process, how we got to this point today, and then I will be running through each of the 17 amendments and providing an overview. I will take a moment after each amendment to take some questions or comments from the councilors and get any direction from councilors or further questions that they might need answered before we move to the LUPS hearing on March 30th. So in September of 2021, the planning department compiled the proposed list of amendments that they had gathered over the previous year and distributed them to the public for their review. The next month, in October of 2021, that department held public meetings and open houses to review those amendments, to take feedback, to explain anything that was in the proposal prior to submitting to the Environmental Planning Commission. They then went on to submit those amendments to the Environmental Planning Commission, the EPC, and the EPC held one hearing on the matter in December of 2021. During that hearing, they took public comment, deliberated the amendments, and unanimously ended up recommending approval to the City Council on both packets. In February of 22, the planning department transmitted all of that information over to the City Council, which allowed us to get it onto the letter of introduction to be formally introduced as legislation. That is O2210 that you are hearing this evening. That takes us to March of 2022. Today, here and now, is the first set of LUPS hearings on the matter. Council staff did distribute the packet of amendments, proposed amendments last week to the public for their review. We hope to continue to receive public comments on those leading up to the March 30th meeting, where the councilors may take a vote on those, but we'll certainly consider them further and continue their deliberation. After the LUPS process concludes, which might be March 30th, but also might not if the committee is not ready to move this packet onto the full council. When they are ready to move it on, whether it's with a recommendation of do pass or no recommendation, the full council will begin their review. So that's all 9 members of the body sometime in the spring or summer of this year. So the EPC, as I mentioned, concluded their process in December. You're considering one bill tonight that is comprised of 2 different applications that the EPC considered. The first one are text amendments to citywide regulations. So those are regulations that apply to all zoning in the city. And the second are amendments to the Old Town Historic Protection Overlay Zone, HPO 5, related to cannabis uses in that small area. Public comment was received on both applications. Public comment was taken during both hearings on these applications. And tonight you have also heard public comment on both of these applications, even though they have been consolidated into one ordinance. So first I'll review the proposed changes to the Old Town HPO 5. On the right, you can see the boundary of the Historic Protection Overlay Zone in blue. Generally, that's Mountain Road to the north, Lomas Boulevard to the south, Rio Grande Boulevard to the west, and 19th Street to the east. The proposal for this small mapped area is to prohibit the following uses: cannabis retail, that's where cannabis related products would be sold; cannabis cultivation, that is where cannabis would be grown; and cannabis derived products manufacturing, that's where you take the grown product and you turn it into something usable for the consumer. All three of those are proposed to be prohibited within this blue mapped area. Generally at the EPC, folks came in support of this prohibition. There wasn't a whole lot of public comment, but there was some. And as I mentioned earlier, the EPC unanimously recommended approval to the City Council. Since that time, since the EPC concluded their deliberation in December, council staff and the council has received written public comment and the verbal testimony you heard tonight. That written public comment has come in the form of 13 letters of support for the prohibition and 6 letters of opposition to the prohibition. Councilors, do you have any questions or comments on this item before I move on to the more general citywide changes?
Councilors, Councilor Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Schultz, I'm just not sure I understand why we would be treating cannabis differently than any other industry or business that is operating in Old Town. It is a completely legal substance, and not sure why we would want to exclude it from one area of town, given that the state legislation says that we can only say reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. But an exclusion from an entire section of town does not seem reasonable to me.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, thank you for those comments. I think there is a little bit of a policy call on this one as to whether cannabis is appropriate in this historic area or not. I will mention that alcohol is also limited in some places in Old Town. It's not a full prohibition, but there are some limitations within the HPO5 related to alcohol, so this tracks a little more closely with that. Otherwise, I think it's a determination of the council whether this is important to the character of Old Town or not.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. I'll just say that I would not have a problem with similar restrictions that are already on the books for alcohol, but I can go to Old Town and have a margarita, and I don't see why I wouldn't be able to go to Old Town and buy cannabis when it becomes available. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Councilor Feeblecorn. Ms. Schultz.
Okay, hearing no other questions on the Old Town conversation, I'll move on to the citywide changes. So this is going to be the packet that was distributed last week that is labeled A through 17. I believe the packet that was distributed last week was A1 through 16. Last night, there was a new packet that added an amendment, and I will talk about each of these individually. Sorry, I'm going to back up that conversation a little bit. Let me talk about what happened at the Environmental Planning Commission first in December before we dive into what the councilors are proposing. The EPC, as I said, heard this in one meeting. There was quite a bit of conversation on primarily 2 topics that I would like the council to be aware of. The first is there was a request from the administration to increase wall heights in the front yard, setback from 3 feet to 4 feet. This is the single topic that got, I think, the most conversation from both the public and the commissioners. There was strong community opposition to this request, and the EPC did end up recommending that it not be approved. We have continued to receive a little bit of public comment on this, even though it is not in the packet for consideration by the council at this LEPS hearing or at full council. The council should know that it did generate a lot of discussion in December. Similarly, there was another request for the overnight shelter use. Today in the IDO, you cannot do an overnight shelter at all in the MXM zone. And if you would like to do it in the MXH zone, you have to go through the conditional use process. The request that was before the EPC was to make it a permissive use in the MXM zone and change it from a conditional use to a permissive use in the MXH zone. That also received some pretty stark community opposition about kind of taking away that conditional use process for the MXH zone and adding it permissively to the MXM zone. The EPC ended up kind of taking a middle of the road approach on this one and said, yes, this might be appropriate in the MXM zone. So what they have recommended to the council is that it be a conditional use in MXM, moving from prohibited to conditional, but that it should retain the conditional use status in the MXH zone. So what's before the committee tonight and what will be before the council later on, if no amendment is made, is conditional in MXM and conditional in MXH. Are there any questions, councilors, about the EPC process or the two kind of hot topics that commission dealt with prior to the LEPS committee?
Councilor Benton.
Madam Chair, yes, just to clarify. So these were the EPC's recommendations. And so therefore the recommendation for increasing front wall heights is not in the packet. And then their recommendation on overnight shelter is conditional and conditional in the two zones. So one remains as it is and the other one it's added as a conditional use in that zone, correct?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, I couldn't have said it better myself. Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. Ms. Schultz.
All right, so now we will move on to the amendments that have popped up since the time that the EPC made their recommendation. These are amendments sponsored by councilors or groups of councilors about topics that they've heard, December, January, February of this year. So the first one is labeled A1 and is related to car washes. We did hear some public comments on this one from a few car wash operators. What this proposes to do is to limit the operating hours of unstaffed car washes. So those are kind of the self-serve car washes that you see around town that typically have kind of big bays that you can drive into and where you wash your car yourself. If this amendment is to pass, those facilities would be limited to business operations between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. So they would have to close at 10 and would not be able to reopen until 7. And there would also be a requirement that there be some signage indicating those business hours. We have heard complaints from some constituents across the city that these kind of self-serve car washes can be a haven for folks to hang out at late at night, and they are not there to wash their cars. They're there to sit in the parking lot and potentially do nuisance activities. And the feedback that we've heard, and it sounds like there might be some conflicting information that I have been asked to seek clarity on from APD, is whether or not, one, that they need that signage posted to be able to tell people to move off of a property, and two, if those business hours have to be kind of established and codified for them to be able to move people off of a property when they're considered to be trespassing. Since the time that this is a new amendment that EPC did not consider, and since it was released last week, staff has received 2 comments of support and 4 comments of opposition. I will say that all of the public comment boxes that you will see on this presentation are public comment received as of 3 p.m. today. So any public testimony that you have just heard may or may not be reflective of that public comment received kind of calculation that I have at the bottom of each amendment. Councilors, are there any questions about this one?
Councilor Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Schultz, I am sponsoring this amendment, and it's because of a lot of constituents that have expressed concern. They live near one of these car washes and they're having noise issues and vagrancy issues all night long. It was my understanding that you needed to have posted hours to allow APD to remove folks from the property in the middle of the night when they are making noise. And so I just want to see if it's my understanding that there would no need to actually close down the equipment at these facilities. It would just be posting an hours up there so that APD, when called about a noise complaint or called about partying in the middle of the night, would have the authority to move people along. Is that correct, or did I misunderstand?
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, some of that question I do need to clarify with APD about what they need to exercise their authority. I did hear that request from Councilor Benson, and I made a note to do that before the 30th. The way that the language is written to limit business hours, it would, people would not be able to utilize the car washing equipment after 10 p.m., whether it's turned on or turned off, or whether there's a gate on the property. If the zoning code says that business cannot be operational after 10, those car washes would have to cease business.
Thanks for the clarification, Ms. Schultz.
Councilors, anything else?
Councilor Benton?
Madam Chair, yeah, I made my request that we hear from APD as to their ability to enforce on this type of a property.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. And I have several questions, but I would also like to talk to APD about this and see where we are with it so that we can all do the right thing instead of causing more problems if it were to go that way. So thank you, Councilor Feeblecorn, for being considerate about this. Are there any other questions? Ms. Schultz?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll move on to Amendment A2. Amendment A2 comes at the request of the Department of Family and Community Services, who are seeking opportunities to convert either abandoned hotels and motels or rundown hotels and motels to some form of affordable housing. The issue that the IDO presents for that is anything that is considered a dwelling unit has to have a full kitchen. The IDO goes on to define what a full kitchen is, and one of the requirements, as I've highlighted in bold here, is a full cooking stove, range, or oven. It is extremely cost prohibitive and a little impractical given the size of these hotel or motel units to provide a full range or stove. So what this amendment does is, in lieu of providing a full kitchen, under some very specific conditions. One, you're converting a non-residential use, most likely that would be a hotel or a motel in this instance, to a residential use, and that project is associated with funding from the department. If you meet those two kind of criteria, then you are allowed to provide a lesser style of kitchen that would not have to have a full cooking stove, range, or oven. The amendment does specify that a hot plate or microwave has to be provided, so there is some kind of warm cooking element, but it takes out the requirement for a full stove. Part of the justification for this amendment and a point worth noting is that housing projects associated with funds from the department do require some on-site services to be provided to the tune of 40 hours. And that's service coordination, such as, helping folks fill out job applications or, helping them find transportation to medical appointments. That is what makes this requirement a little unique. I know that we've heard public comment that some folks would like stricken the requirement that these projects can only occur when associated with housing funds from the city. But I think there could be a benefit to requiring that those housing funds be provided because of the service requirement associated with them. I do believe that we have some folks from the department in the Zoom today. Mr. Moya, do you see Ms. Huval in the participant section? If there are questions about the intention of this amendment or what the department was looking for, we do have some experts who can answer those. Any questions, councilors?
Councilors, I don't see any hands. I guess not at this time. We'll probably come back and try this again when we hear it on the 30th. So thank you. Ms. Huval will not be needed to speak on this. Ms. Schultz, if you'd like to continue.
I will. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms. Huval, for making yourself available tonight. Okay, we will move on to Amendment A3. A3 and A4 are related, but they do different things. They are related in that they are both applicable to cottage developments. Amendment A3 proposes to change the calculation for cottage development to allow fractions of numbers to be used. The way that the calculation is written today, the IDO requires that you round down certain components of that calculation. There is not a need to round down in this calculation, and when the council adopted the cottage development regulations, they did not specify that there were to be any rounding. This was something that the planning department put into the document as an editorial change to help what they thought was clarity and consistency with the document, but it did fundamentally change how that calculation turns out. And so this amendment would kind of bring back the original intent of the equation as it was originally drafted to allow fractions of numbers to be used. If you look in the amendment itself, in the explanation section, there are some sample equations where you can see where the rounding comes into play. I'm happy to go over those equations with the committee now if they would like to delve into some complicated math at 7 p.m. But I'm also happy to if there aren't any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Counselors, does anyone else not want to hear this? Thank you, Ms. Schultz. I think we'll do this at a later date.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just note that there were 2 comments of support, and you also heard some support via verbal public comment this evening. The next amendment, LUPS Amendment A4, again related to cottage development, also changes the formula a little bit, only for cottage development associated with the R1D zone district. So the IDO kind of chops up the R1 zone district into 4 what we call flavors, A, B, C, and D. And those flavors range from small to large. So A is the smallest lot R1 zone, B is bigger, C is even bigger, and D is the largest. The idea behind this amendment is in the R1D zone, where you are expected to have the largest type of lot in the city, that it might be appropriate to allow for more square footage of cottage development on those particular properties. And so the proposal before the committee tonight is to increase the calculation, part of the calculation for the R1D zone district in cottage development from 2,000 square feet to 2,600 square feet. Again, there were 2 comments of support provided for this amendment, and you heard public testimony this evening of support as well. Are there any questions? All right, hearing none, we will move on to LUPS Amendment A5. LUPS Amendment A5 is a bundle of changes all related to cannabis uses. Last year, the council established regulations for cannabis uses in the IDO. As you know, we predicted that adult use cannabis was going to be legalized and was coming to get some kind of basic land use regulations into our zoning framework. These changes kind of further build upon what the council established last year. The highlights of these changes are that cannabis retail and on-site consumption, so where you're selling the product and where you're consuming the product that you just bought from that commercial enterprise, those business hours would be limited to 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. So outside of that, you would not be able to purchase cannabis products, and you would not be able to consume those on those retail sites. That recommendation came in part from a cannabis consultant that the planning department hired to take kind of a broad look at the cannabis framework in the city, and also has been supported by APD, who has expressed concern over these types of businesses that have the potential to be very cash heavy, open late at night. So that restriction relates to those proposals. The second piece is that those on-site consumption areas that I was just discussing would be required to be conducted fully indoors. That's kind of a long zoning way of saying that you couldn't have smoking patios or patio areas that are outdoors to consume these products. One of the requirements for an on-site consumption area is that an air filtration plan has to be provided and approved by the city. And when you start consuming in an outdoor setting, there's not a way to filter any of the air associated with that location. And so for practical purposes, it wouldn't make sense to have an outdoor on-site consumption area. The third change is to limit the size of cannabis retail locations. Gosh, I think I have a typo here. I'm so sorry. This says in the MXM zone that is supposed to read in the MXT zone, the mixed use transition zone. I apologize, and I will fix that before we meet on the 30th. All other retail uses in the MXT zone are limited to 10,000 square feet. The MXT zone is the mixed use transition zone. It tends to be next to low density residential neighborhoods as a way to buffer them from more intense development. And therefore, we want to keep those retail sizes small to honor that transition and to kind of honor the neighborhood scale commercial that it's supposed to be providing. When we created the cannabis retail use last year, honestly, this was just something that was an oversight. It should have also, this 10,000 square foot limit should have also been applicable in the MXT zone to be consistent with other retail uses. The last bit of this would require that cannabis cultivation uses, where you're growing the product, and cannabis derived products manufacturing, where you're preparing the product for consumption, have to provide a letter of availability from the Albuquerque Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority with their application to the city. My understanding is this letter of availability is already required to be submitted to the state for their licensing requirements. And so theoretically should be something that these cultivators and manufacturers already have on hand and would also just be added to the city records. Staff has not heard any comments on this bundle of changes from the public. Councilors, are there any questions?
Yes, Councilor Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand the last four or the last three requirements, but I do have a question about the first one, limiting the hours of operation from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. Ms. Schultz, can you say why those hours were chosen as opposed to any other limitation on hours?
Sure. Madam Chair, Feeblecorn, I might ask to call on Director Varela from the Planning Department. I know that he worked on some rulemaking associated with cannabis uses in the city and also had some interaction with a consultant that made some of these recommendations and could probably give you a better explanation of where that came from. Director Varela, are you available?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
We can, yes, thank you.
And Council Committee Chair and Councilor Feeblecorn, thank you for that question. Originally, the retail, which means recreational, and on-site consumption also for recreational hours were proposed to be from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. However, during the rulemaking process, we did receive some inquiries and some convincing arguments from some people saying that it would be better for us if we could extend those hours from what we originally proposed. 8 a.m. Would be early enough so that if somebody was perhaps on their way to work, they could go over and make their purchase. There was also some confusion that this somehow also applied to the medical cannabis group. This is purely for retail, recreational. This does not apply to the medical dispensaries. And people were worried that if they needed only to go to a retail dispensary, which is supposed to also sell up to 25% of their product to medical, that it might be too inconvenient if it was not open until 10 o'clock. And likewise at night, if they're getting out of work, they wanted a little bit of extra time. So we increased the amount of time. We did consult with the police department on this, and the police department was extremely concerned about late hours for cannabis recreational sales, since it is almost entirely right now a cash-based business. My understanding is you cannot use your Visa card or your debit card to go in and buy the cannabis. You need to pay cash on that. And the same with the on-site consumption, you need to be paying cash. And they said the absolute last thing that would be advisable in Albuquerque is to have a cash-based business where people are getting high, open late into the middle of the night. There will be trouble there, either between customers or most likely from somebody coming in to rob people. And given the violence in Albuquerque and such, they said that if we were to leave those things open 24/7, as perhaps maybe one person advocated for, that the chances of there being even a homicide at one of those businesses would actually be quite realistic within the first year. So we expanded it from 8 a.m. to 11 p.m., but that's as far as we felt was reasonable in light of the advice that we got.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could just make a comment, I hear the concern about cash-heavy businesses, but the reality is there are a lot of cash-heavy businesses in the city of Albuquerque, and many of them, including nightclubs and bars and convenience stores, are open much later than 11 p.m. And if we heard anything tonight during public comment, I certainly heard that limiting the business hours of one type of business is unfair. And so, again, cannabis is a legal business, and I would be fine if we were limiting the hours of operation to hours that are similar to what we are limiting alcohol sales for, but we are not. And so I think this is an unfair prohibition on sales for one type of business within the city. Thanks.
Thank you, Council Feeblecorn.
Okay, moving on. If there are other questions, I'm sorry, councilors, is there anything else on A5? Okay. Moving on down to A6, this is an amendment related to freestanding internally lit signs. This proposal would prohibit freestanding signs that are internally illuminated. So you'd have to meet those two criteria. Your sign would have to meet those two criteria within 200 feet of any direction of a residential zone district. I've provided images of two signs that meet this criteria that are freestanding, internally illuminated, sorry. And council staff has heard over the last several months, if not a couple of years, about some signs popping up across the city that tend to be on the corner of the property and are just beacons of light because of the nature of a freestanding sign that's internally illuminated. When you have a freestanding sign that is externally illuminated, i.e. would have kind of a light shining onto the sign element instead of the light coming from inside the sign element, those tend to be much less egregious because that light is focused on the sign. In these instances, the light is focused totally outwards and can be very bright. So there are other types of signs that commercial property owners would be able to do if they were within 200 feet of a residential zone district, just not this type of freestanding illuminated sign. Any questions, councilors? Okay, hearing none, we will move on to LUPS Amendment A7. Also related to interior lighting, but a little bit different. This amendment would require that self-storage facilities that are also within 200 feet of a residential zone district dim their internal lighting to 50% of the maximum allowed lighting. The IDO does have measurements for what level of lighting can spill off of your property. And what this amendment would say is whatever that allowance is, self-storage units after the hours or between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. have to be at 50% that number. I've provided an image here of the types of self-storage units that Albuquerque has seen across the city pop up, and they're these big kind of glass boxes, and some of them are lit all night long. And that is, again, I'll use the same word, kind of a beacon of light, similar to the sign amendment that we heard about previously. And so this would not require a property owner to turn their lights totally off. It would just require them to be dimmed between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Staff did receive one comment of support for this amendment. Any questions, councilors? All right.
Council Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Schultz, can you just talk about the 50% reduction requirement? It still seems like a lot of light to me. And I'm just wondering why we chose the 50% rather than a 25% or somewhere in a much more dim situation.
Sure, Councilor. The city has been able to take lighting measurements for some of these facilities over the past couple years that they've started to pop up in the city, and 50% seemed like an appropriate level to not spill off the property line in an egregious way that we see them spilling now. we have not asked any particular property owner to show us what 50% looks like. So this might be a little bit of a guess, but seemed like a good starting point. And because we crack open the IDO year after year, if 50% still is not doing the job, we will come back next year and amend that number.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Feeble-Corn. Good question.
Any other questions, councilors?
No,
All
thank you.
Moving on to Amendment A8. This is related to bicycle parking requirements. The IDO does require bicycle parking with development activity, and the calculation specific to elementary, middle, and high schools has proven to be a little problematic. The Environmental Planning Commission heard a case last month for a charter school who had to comply with this provision. And the way that their site plan ended up working out was they have a body of about 700 students, and we're going to be required to provide 160 bicycle parking spaces. Anecdotally, they testified to the commission that they have maybe 20 to 25 staff and students who bike to school. And so having to provide 160 was a lot. It was a lot more than they needed. And it took up space on their site that they could be using for other things, either, incidental facilities for their campus or otherwise. So the proposal here is to move from the current requirement, which is 3 spaces per classroom, to a requirement that more closely mirrors how other non-residential uses calculate bicycle parking. So in this instance, it would be 5 spaces or 15% of the required off-street parking spaces, whichever number is greater. If we're to apply this new calculation to that previous development I was just discussing, they would be required to provide about 21 spaces under this regulation, which is a little more aligned with what they told us was the actual need for their student body. An important note that IDO regulations are not applicable to APS schools. APS is a function of the state, and the state as an entity is not applicable or subject to city regulation. So this would really only affect charter schools, and staff did not put any public comment on this.
Thank you. And Councilor Benjamin, you have a question?
I did not. It had to do with that APS question. APS is not subject to our zoning. So this would be primarily private schools. It is, on that note, however, I wonder what APS's standards are for this, if any. Do we know that, Ms. Schultz?
Madam Chair, Councilor Benson, I don't know, but I would be happy to reach out to APS to ask that question.
Thank you. I'd just be curious about that.
Thank you. Councilor Feeble-Corn, you have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair. The 15% number in the example that Ms. Schultz did would get us to 21 spaces. They had indicated that they needed about 20 for what's happening now. As we move forward with climate change and we have, a move towards more people biking, we're trying to encourage more biking. It seems to me that that 15% might be somewhat small. I'm totally for, moving it down, but it seems like 20 or 25% might be a better indicator of what the future need for bike parking would be.
Thank you, Councilor Feeble-Corn.
Thank you, Councilor Feeble-Corn. I've made a note of that to follow up with you before LUPS on the 30th, in case you'd like to move in a different direction than what's presented here. Any other questions on A8, councilors? All right. Moving on to Amendment A9, this is related to townhouse development in certain zones in certain corridors of the city. The proposal here is to prohibit townhouses, which are by definition a form of low density residential development, prohibit them in the MXL, MXM, and MXH zone districts where those parcels are within a premium transit area. The map that I've provided here that I hope is large enough for you to see shows the Central Avenue corridor and the stretch of Louisiana where we have premium transit areas. Those are defined in the IDO as 660 feet around a premium transit station. So what this amendment would do is within all of these little black circles, if you have MXL, MXM, or MXH zoning, you would not be able to do a townhouse development. I think the policy reasoning behind this is our transit corridor is supposed to be our most dense corridor of the city. And by permitting townhouse development, again, a form of low density residential development, that is not really honoring the policy intention of that transit corridor. Staff has received 2 comments of opposition to this request, some of which you heard during public testimony tonight. Do you have any questions, councilors? Okay, moving on to Amendment A10. Amendment A10 strikes the requirement in the IDO that multifamily development 25 units or greater and all non-residential development, excluding industrial development, has to provide a climatic responsiveness analysis and a geographic responsiveness analysis. These are 2 types of analyses that were put into the IDO last year to require a property owner to really look at how their building is situated in relation to how the sun shines on their building. That's the climatic responsiveness side. The geographic responsiveness side requires property owners to orient their buildings to look at views. Those views are expressly named in the IDO as the Sandia Mountains, the Bosque, and the Rio Grande, the volcanoes, and the Northwest Mesa Escarpment. Staff has heard from folks in the development community that these requirements feel arbitrary because they don't have teeth to them. They certainly have to submit the analysis, but there's nothing in here that tells the city what to do with that analysis after it's been submitted. The IDO is not a document that should have, kind of non-regulatory language in it. It is a regulatory document, and without those teeth, I think the idea behind the sponsor for this one was that it wasn't appropriate here.
Thank you. And Councilor Benton, you have a question?
Yeah, just really a comment and a little bit of background on this. This was put into the IDO last year, and I opposed it at that time, not because it's not well intentioned, and it was disappointing that people thought that this was really going to change design of buildings. It doesn't. It's really just putting the development team into a situation where they must do calculations and illustrations that are not really reviewed by anyone. So it doesn't require that anything be done about this climatic responsiveness or geographic responsiveness, which I agree that you'd have to be pretty crazy as a developer if you didn't take advantage of a view that you could have otherwise. But it really arose from a disappointment in the quality of design of some of the multifamily, multi-story buildings, and those are legitimate concerns as well. But I do feel that this is a very arbitrary and inappropriate place to put something like this that has absolutely no teeth to it, other than to require that a form be submitted and a bunch of drawings be submitted that don't accomplish anything. So I do support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. I don't see any other questions, Ms. Schultz.
All right, moving on to Amendment A11. This amendment proposes to change the calculation for parking associated with multifamily development, general retail development, and grocery store development. Overall, the way that these calculations play out, there will be a reduced requirement in parking for those 3 uses. Council staff received some calculations and data from developers who you heard from this evening during public testimony about recent developments they've put together that are just being overparked, that residents and guests of those residents are not utilizing all the parking that is being required. That space that's being used for that parking could be used for other things on their site, like landscaping or amenities, or even more units. now that we have some data to kind of support that the IDO requires too much parking, this calculation aims to reduce that a little bit. There is also some analysis in the amendment about the retail side of the parking reduction. Staff did some research on sister cities to Albuquerque to see what kind of parking requirements they have for commercial developments. I'm sorry, for retail and grocery store development in particular. And Albuquerque as a city is requiring more parking than most of our sister cities. So this tries to go with a best practices approach and match what some comparable jurisdictions are doing. There was one comment of support for this amendment and one comment of opposition that staff received prior to the LUPS hearing. Any questions about that one, councilors?
Yes, Councilor Benton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just on this, just to be clear, this wouldn't prevent someone from adding more parking who is developing a business or a multifamily development, correct, Ms. Schultz?
Madam Chair. Councilor Benton, thank you for that question. Yeah, that's an important distinction, that the parking requirements in the IDO are all minimums. The IDO doesn't have maximum parking requirements. And so while we require a minimum number of spaces, if a developer is aware that the market needs something different for their particular development, they are more than welcome to provide more than the minimum.
Right. I mean, I think, that is kind of a market response. And what most of us see, I think, when we look at so many parking lots is that they're largely empty. How many of these commercial parking lots, just taking a grocery store as an example, do you see that every single space is full? Rarely, maybe in the extreme depth of the holiday season, but the rest of the time they're sitting there baking in the sun. So I think this is a good amendment.
Thank you, Councilor Benson. Are there any other questions about A11? Okay, A12 and A13 are related but distinct. A12 proposes to create a new land use called safe outdoor spaces. In its entirety, this amendment identifies the zone districts where the safe outdoor space use can occur. It creates some use-specific standards for the use and creates a definition. Generally speaking, this amendment aims to do some of the things you heard public testimony about today, provide a safe space for people who are living on the streets today in a tent or in their car or in their RV, sometimes on our sidewalks and our alleys and our arroyos. This would provide an opportunity for these folks to have a safe space for them to put those things they're living in, have somewhere safe for their belongings, have somewhere to wash their hands, to use the restroom, as a way to combat the kind of unhoused crisis we're seeing in Albuquerque today. I'll talk a little bit about some of the standards associated with this use that I think are important to point out, that there are some kind of built-in protections. The intention is not to just allow, tents to show up on a parking lot kind of unregulated. So for example, for safe outdoor spaces, there's a prohibition that these can't occur within 330 feet, which is about a city block, and in proximity to the RA, R1, RMC, or RT zone district that contains low density residential development. That's a long-winded zony way of saying that these can't be within a block of our kind of established residential low density neighborhoods, that there's got to be some kind of buffer, whether it's another property or not, that within 330 feet you couldn't do these. There's also a cap on how many what we call designated spaces can be in each of these safe outdoor spaces. So the safe outdoor space is the use as a whole, and within each of those safe outdoor spaces, there will be 40 designated spaces for someone to pull in their car, to pitch their tent, to park their RV, with a maximum of 40, so that these don't become wildly large and unmanageable. There are requirements for toilets and hand washing stations to the tune of 1 toilet per 8 designated space. and 1 hand washing station per 10 designated spaces. You heard some public comment today asking, where did that 1 per 8 number come from? Where did that 1 per 10 number come from? Staff has looked at a couple of developments that helped guide that number. One, there's a product down in Las Cruces that I always mess up the name on. I don't think it's Hope Village. It's not Hope Work, Camp Hope, maybe. Camp Hope down in Las Cruces does something very similar to what we would expect this safe outdoor space to look like. And their bathroom calculation is very similar to that. We have heard from private property owners in the city who want to do safe outdoor spaces, who have gotten so far as to sketch out a site plan for these types of things, and 1 bathroom per 8 designated spaces seem to fit okay and seem to be a reasonable accommodation. Again, because this use is so new to the IDO, that one per 8 was what we came up with based on what we could see others doing. But if that turns out not to be the right calculation, we will have the opportunity to change that number in future IDO updates.
Ms. Schultz, if I may ask a question?
Yes.
Since this is rather vague, the way it was presented and probably the way it's written, we're not talking about someone sees a vacant lot, they can go start setting up tents and sleeping bags and staying there. We're talking about a truly designated areas for this type of thing. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, that's correct. And some of the standards that I'll continue to read about would be required for this type of development that do really formalize it as a land use and not just some kind of arbitrary location where folks are choosing to pitch a tent.
So simplistically, because I kind of think that way. So this would be an organized, someone will be managing and supervising and helping the people with a facility like this.
Madam Chair, thanks for that question. There is a requirement in the form of a use-specific standard that says that each of these safe outdoor spaces have to include a management plan or a security agreement that's to ensure the safety of the residents, and proof of that agreement has to be submitted with the application to the city, and that plan or agreement has to outline either on-site or on-call support to the residents of that area 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Thank you. That helps clarify it for me. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, you're welcome. Let's see, there are also some setback requirements. So any of these designated spaces and the lavatories, the bathrooms associated with them would need to be set back 20 feet from the property line if the property is abutting the RML zone district or RMH zone district or any mixed use zone district. That's to say that the designated spaces couldn't be right up against the lot line, and a 5-foot setback for any other zone district that aren't one of those 3 that I just listed. There's some screening requirements to the tune of a 6-foot either wall or fence or vegetative screen that is opaque has to be provided around the designated spaces. That's, I think, kind of twofold to help with the visual appeal of these safe outdoor spaces, but also to provide the residents or the folks staying there some privacy and protection. That requirement for an opaque wall or fence, opaque meaning solid, 6 feet high. Lastly, there is a requirement for 2 parking spaces per each of these developments. You know, if there's going to be services provided on site, that staff needs somewhere to park. And the IDO does regulate parking by use. And so that requirement would be added for this use. Councilors, are there any questions about safe outdoor spaces?
Councilor Benton?
It's just a quick comment with regard to parking spaces. They're also at these, the ones that we saw in Denver, which there was a good tour of the campgrounds in Denver. There are also volunteer organizations that will arrive to deliver food, et cetera, for the residents of the campgrounds. And, so we might want to think a little bit about those parking spaces. And I just advocated for not having too many. in a different type of development. But here we might want to just think that through of what that looks like, because they have a volunteer organization that will show up maybe with a couple of vehicles and deliver food. So that might be that in addition to a staff presence.
Madam Chair, Councilor Benton, thanks for that comment. I'll mention again that those are parking minimums. So if the particular development knew that they were going to be partnering with volunteer organizations, they certainly could voluntarily provide more parking. But if that 2-space minimum makes you uncomfortable, I've made a note to follow up with you before the March 30th hearing, and we can discuss that a little further.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps some kind of loading zone or something like that. That's not just creating a bunch of parking space. Thank you.
Thank you. And Council Feebakorn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions. We heard from the Reverend from First Unitarian, I believe, Church, that they are actually considering this type of project on their parking lot area. And, we heard that he thinks that might be a real problem for them if we require the fencing. And I also have concerns about fencing. I did speak with some folks today, and did get a little bit different viewpoint that it might be beneficial to the folks who are camping there to have some privacy. But I'm just concerned that we're making this too hard for entities that want to provide a safe outdoor space. And so I'm wondering if there's any thought to either not requiring a fence, or at least making it applicable for the 2-year time frame that we allowed for you to get a composting toilet in place, to also allow a couple of years to get that fencing installed, so that we don't have to wait for 2 years for these churches and other great community organizations to be able to offer this service.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feebakorn, I've written down those comments, and I'd be happy to take those to the sponsors of this, two of which are on this committee, one who is not. But before the 30th, I'd be happy to have those discussions to see if there's a way to, if there's a way and a will to address your issue with the fencing.
And interesting, Councilor Feebakorn, if I may, my concern was that the fence was going up in no small matter to protect the residents and the citizens of the camping area, because there's such crazy things going on today. So it could go either way. I think we should discuss it both ways, because we certainly don't, if there isn't appropriate supervision, we certainly don't want to put people who are already in a hardship, we don't want to put them in harm's way because we haven't considered protecting them. So I was going the other direction with it. So I think we could talk about this a little more and see what best practice is on this kind of thing.
I agree, Madam Chair. My take on it was that I didn't want it to be, behind closed doors, so that folks that are staying there are experiencing, unsafe conditions. I now see the exact opposite could also be a concern. So I would like to continue that conversation. I did have one more question. I don't believe in here, in either A12 or A13, we have a reference to refuse containers. And I just wanted to see if that is something that is covered elsewhere in the IDO, or if we need to include something about requiring trash receptacles in these types of areas.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feebakorn, thanks for that question. I think it's a really good one. Off the top of my head, I know somewhere there's a requirement that development in the city has to provide dumpsters. I'm not sure if that's in the IDO or if that's in a standalone solid waste ordinance, but I can make a note of that to follow up with you on before the 30th. If there's not a requirement, we can look at putting that into A12 and A13 if there's interest. And if it is covered, I can share that reference in the code with you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I had one more question. On the section 6, where we talk about a safe outdoor space shall include social services and support facilities, Is the requirement going to be on the group that is providing the safe outdoor space, or should that be more that they're providing an outlet for the city to provide those services to people that are in this safe outdoor space? I just worry again that if, you know, a church or another community organization wants to open up a safe outdoor space, if we're requiring them to offer these social services as well, it's just another barrier that might be really costly and intensive for them to be able to work with them.
Madam Chair, Councillor Feeblecorn, the provisions in the IDO are applicable to the property owner or the agent kind of occupying their property. And so this requirement would be on whoever is operating the safe outdoor space. That's not to say that the agreement couldn't look something like, you know, we're going to provide space on the property for the city, for city staff or some kind of nonprofit organization to come in a certain amount of hours a week to work with the residents here. But that is on the private property owner or the SOS operator.
Thank you. Councillor Benton?
Yeah, just following up on that, you know, it basically, again, just knowing what I've seen, which is in Denver, they're basically creating a place. There's a common place with a common space within the campground, for lack of a better word. The common space is including a little office that is for staff, but depending on the acuity of the need of the person who is being served, these are outside entities who come in. So I think, you know, we might not want to get so heavily into making it sound like the property owner is being responsible for this service. However, there should be consideration made that outside providers would be coming regularly to the site to meet with some of the residents to help them with their needs.
Madam Chair, Councillor Benson, thank you for those comments. I'd like to work more with planning staff on how they would interpret that language in the definition to see if the kind of framework that you just outlined could meet that definition. And if not, maybe we can look at some shift in that language to make that happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think we're finished for a little while, Ms. Schultz.
Okay, we will move on to A13. A13 is temporary campgrounds. This has a lot of overlap with safe outdoor spaces and what safe outdoor spaces proposes, but there are some kind of important distinctions between the two uses. I think the most obvious one is that temporary campgrounds are meant to be temporary in nature. A safe outdoor space could occur in perpetuity on a property, whereas a temporary campground would be limited to operations of 1 year with the potential for a 1-year extension. So a possible maximum of 2 years. The zoning districts that they are allowed in vary slightly, and I can review those changes anecdotally if I can open my document here. Safe outdoor spaces are proposed conditionally in the MXT and MXL zone and permissively in MXM, MXH, NRC, NRBP, NRLM, and NRGM. Whereas temporary campgrounds are not proposed conditionally anywhere, but instead are proposed permissively in MXT, L, M, and H, and then NRC, BP, LM, and GM. So these are potentially a little more widely available because there's no conditional use process associated with them. Another distinction between the two is the distance separation requirements. A temporary campground is prohibited within 25 feet of the RA, R1, RMC, RT, or RML zone. If you'll recall, the safe outdoor space had similar prohibitions to the tune of 330 feet. Temporary campgrounds are much smaller. I think to acknowledge kind of their temporary nature, that they're not a permanent use, and they are prohibited within 25 feet of a mixed use zone district containing a residential use. Another distinction I'll back up and say the restroom and hand washing requirements are very similar across the two. They both require them. The numbers are a little bit different, but they are both required. The density question is a little different for temporary campgrounds. SOSs said that you could have 40 designated spaces for the entire project site. Doesn't matter how big your project site is. It could be half an acre, it could be 3 acres. You can only accommodate 40 spaces. For temporary campgrounds, it takes a slightly different approach and says you can do 25 campsites per acre. So as your site gets larger, you can accommodate more campsites. That is just a different way of thinking about the density question of the designated spaces. Let's see. The temporary campground does also have very similar setback requirements. So campsites and any associated lavatories have to be set back from the property line 25 feet. SOSs had a similar requirements. The temporary campground use does say that if your campsites are more than 100 feet in from the property, that you don't have to provide any of the buffering and screening that would normally be required. If they're not more than 100 feet in, then you do have to provide the same 6-foot high opaque wall, fence, or vegetative screen. There are no parking requirements for temporary campgrounds. We just talked about the two required parking spaces for SOSs. Temporary campgrounds is silent on this, which would, I think, be interpreted as there are no parking requirements. So overall, these uses have some overlap. They are not in conflict with each other. The council could certainly adopt both. They are two different approaches to the same issue. And the use specific standards are really tailored for the intention of each of the uses as they exist distinctly. Are there any questions about temporary campgrounds?
Yes, Councilor Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Schultz, I understand the temporary part of this, but there's such an incredible need. I'm just wondering what the 1 year was based on, and if there was any conversation around going up to 2 years for these temporary campgrounds, given the crisis that we're in Albuquerque.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, I will point out that it's 1 year with a 1 year extension. So you can do it for a year and then you have to come request permission to do it for another year. But essentially, if the planning department, accepts that extension, then you are allowed to do it for 2 years at a time. If you're interested in looking at 2 years by right, instead of not having an extension, I think we can have that conversation. I think that surrounds the concept of what is temporary and what does the IDO consider temporary. And I don't know that word is well defined in the document, so we might have an opportunity here to think about that.
Thank you. I did not realize the extension was an option, so that clarifies it for me.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, great. Councilor Benton, sorry.
Thank you. I sponsored this and co-sponsored the other one as well. But I think these are both have some room for tweaking, and I hope we can get them to where they need. But I wanted to point out that I think we as a council have our ears very open to suggestions, especially from the provider community. No one's really done one of these yet in the city, so we do have to rely on best practices from elsewhere. But I'm very open to amending this or discussing amendments to the other amendment A12 as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Benton. I think we'll probably take a couple good hard look at these. Thank you. Councilor Feeblecorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to flag the same issue that I had in A12, which is the trash receptacles. I just want to make sure that we cover that in both. And I also want to just say that I completely agree with Councilor Benton. These are both really important, and I would love to hear from people that are actually considering setting these up, what could make this stronger. So thank you.
Madam Chair, Councilor Feeblecorn, thank you. I've made a note for the trash receptacles for this one as well, and we'll be sure to follow up. Seeing no other questions, I'll move on to Amendment A14. This is related to existing utilities and utility easements that exist in areas that are proposed to be vacated as public right-of-way. So when a property owner wants to vacate a piece of public right-of-way, that essentially means that vacated portion is no longer public right-of-way, and that private property owner kind of absorbs it into their private property lines. The folks at PNM have come to ask a question, or at least request a clarification in the IDO to say, well, what happens when there are utilities in that public right-of-way? And the city has just said that that's no longer a public right-of-way and now is private property. And the IDO should make a nod to this and should at least address the question. And so the language that's been crafted in the amendment by city legal requires that in the event that a portion of right-of-way is to be vacated and contains utilities, that there are some procedures outlined for how the property owner should go interact with that utility provider to ensure that they still have access, whether it's through an easement or some other kind of private agreement between that owner and the utility agency to ensure access can be retained for that utility agency. It should not be the city's job to determine how that access is maintained. That really should be a private agreement between the private property owner and the agency, and the IDO says what is proposed to say as much. Any questions, councilors? Okay, moving on to A15. We are very close to the end here. And this one should be pretty quick. LUPS Amendment A15 proposes to add what I would characterize as boilerplate language to the ordinance itself. So this is not a change to the IDO. This is a change to the ordinance that will adopt the changes to the IDO. Every ordinance that is going to change the code of ordinances needs to have language to tell the compiling agency what pieces of that ordinance need to be compiled into the code and which ones should not be compiled into the code. I think the most obvious example of this is we typically don't compile whereas clause language into our code of ordinances. We typically only compile the regulatory pieces of the document. This language is missing from the ordinance and simply needs to be added so that the compilers know to only add the language that's being changed in the IDO to the code of ordinances. Any questions on that one, councilors? I'm assuming not. Okay. A16 is a spreadsheet of what can be characterized as technical edits. It's a spreadsheet that's got 8 lines in it. These lines are applicable to sections all across the IDO. And these are changes at the request of the planning department as they have continued to work with city staff and code enforcement on implementing the IDO, issues that have cropped up since the EPC made their decision in December. So over the last 3 months, there have been additional issues identified with the enforceability of some of the language in the IDO, or vague language or language that conflicts with other sections of the IDO. This amendment proposes to fix those. The prior amendments that you've heard tonight have all been pretty substantive in nature that do make kind of substantive policy calls on regulations in the IDO. This spreadsheet of technical amendments does not do that. It just makes better the language that already exists in the document. Are there any questions on that, councilors? All right, last but not least, we are on to A17. So this is an amendment that is new from the time that the packet was published last week, and this is related to the variance process in the IDO. Today, when a property owner wants to come request a variance, that is to say that they can't comply with a requirement in the IDO because of how their lot is configured. The IDO offers that relief valve through the variance process. There's a pretty high bar of criteria that they have to kind of justify and meet to do that. One of those criteria says that the variance will not materially undermine the intent and purposes of this IDO or applicable zone district. The proposed language here would also add or any applicable overlay zone. This is to give a nod to the overlay zones and the special character that they are meant to maintain, to say if you want to vary from a provision in an overlay zone, you need to provide a little bit of extra justification specific to that overlay zone to talk about how you're not undermining the intent of it. This language could probably be interpreted as already required in the IDO because of the kind of starter sentence there about how the variance will not materially undermine the intent and purpose of this IDO. You know, an overlay zone is in the IDO. So this is kind of calling out overlay zones specifically, which may be appropriate as they are special places that we do want to maintain the character of, and too many wild variances could start to deteriorate that character. So this is just to make sure that the ZHE and city staff is kind of keeping an eye on those variance requests that come through within overlay zones to make sure that they're acknowledging those overlay zones and discussing how they're not being undermined. Any questions on that last and final amendment, councilors?
Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Schultz. Very good. Very good. That's a complicated issue, and I appreciate what you've said to us. So, councilors, are there any questions or comments in addition to this? If not, I would like to move deferral to March 30th LUPS meeting. I need a second on that. I have 2 seconds, Councilor Feeblecorn and Councilor Benton. So Ms. Montoya, would you take a vote on that, please?
Counselor Benton,
Yes.
Counselor Feeblecorn,
Yes.
Counselor Pena,
Yes.
Counselor Sanchez, excused, Counselor Jones.
Yes.
That passes on a 4-0 vote.
And, Counselor Pena, do you have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair, just a matter of clarification. I was wanting to ask the staff earlier on the other vote that we took for the R22-8. I had asked for a motion for deferral, and then Councilor Benton had actually said that, point of order, that the motion on the floor was, but it's my understanding that a motion for deferral trumps motions. So I just wanted to get clarification on that. If not, I'd like to ask the staff to get clarification for the next meeting so that we can, make sure that we did that properly.
Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, I'm going to call on any legal staff that we might have in the call tonight to identify that issue. It sounds like Councilor Benton made a motion of a due pass. Before that motion was voted on, Councilor Pena requested a motion for deferral, but the committee proceeded with the motion for due pass first, which was successful. Hi, Mr. Morrow. Thanks for being here. Did we need to rectify that motion for deferral before moving forward with the motion of due pass?
And Madam Chair, Councilor Pena, I do believe that motions to defer are precedential and that they do take priority over ordinary motions. I cannot swear to it at this point. So I think typically the motion to defer is something that should be heard prior to any motions. Any other motions on a particular matter, but I'm happy to clarify that and get back to you if that is helpful. Sorry, I don't have a more definitive answer, but my belief is that they are supposed to be precedential.
Madam Chair, and I don't want to continue this meeting. I know we're all tired. We've been here. So maybe if it was done incorrectly, then we could just rehear it again at our next meeting. Or would it have to be something that gets addressed at this meeting?
So,
and one of the was
here, Councilor Pena, my understanding is that the motion was sent to the full council, but I believe it was to be introduced at the meeting on the 21st. Is that correct, Ms. Schultz?
Madam Chair, Mr. Martin, it would be reported out on the 21st, so no action would be taken. Reported out from committee with no action.
Thank you. And Councilor Benton has his hand up also.
Yeah, I think we would probably need to resolve it now. As I recall, there's discussion about a deferral. I don't know that there was a motion made for deferral. But I think my response on that, just to kind of revisit it, I think at the time was that we were, it had to do with the ability of the advisory board to meet prior to us hearing it at full council. So I thought that was satisfactory, but so I think that's what happened. So there might have been some confusion there because there was not a recognition of a motion for deferral or a second taken or anything like
Yes,
that.
if I may, Councillor Benton, to interrupt for a second, I'm asking for some advice here since we have a lot of people listening. It's my understanding, their understanding that there wasn't a true motion to defer, that it was not seconded. And we went forth with your motion that had already had a second on it. So that one would stand, but obviously it can be brought back at another meeting with the amount of votes that it will take to do that. So,
Madam Chair, yeah, so I think that what I did make the motion, I actually asked my staff to clarify and make sure that I made the motion before I said this, but the motion wasn't recognized. So that's something, once you make that motion, it sets precedence, and actually we should have acted on it and either got a second or not got a second on it. And we didn't do that. So I would just say that maybe we can get some clarification and address it at the next meeting.
I think that's a great idea, Councillor, since we're getting different counseling here on the correct way to do it. So I'm sure we can get it straightened out. So are we all comfortable with that for now? In that case, is there any other business that we should bring forward? Therefore, I move, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.